integration is not possible from a place of incommensurability, because integration then simply means co-option. It means that everything that is distinctive, unique, and important about these forms of knowledge, not everything, but some things, they are translated away.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we try to build a robust, credible argument for conserving nature and its biodiversity, which sometimes means stepping back to question assumptions that we environmentalists take for granted. I'm your host, Andre Mada. In its purest form, environmental science is meant to describe the world objectively and let policymakers decide what to do about it. But what if the tools we rely on, assessments, indicators, models, do more than describe and quietly help shape decision-making? Why do certain framings of biodiversity come to feel like simple facts rather than choices? And what happens to other forms of knowledge when we try to integrate them into scientific narratives? To explore these questions, I spoke with Esther Turnhout, Professor of Science, Technology and Society at the University of Twente. Esther's work focuses on how scientific knowledge is produced, made authoritative, and put to work in biodiversity policy, including through assessments like those of IPBES. We discuss how facts and values become entangled in environmental science, what tends to go wrong in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaboration, and whether plural knowledge systems can really be integrated. In closing, we transition onto a broader topic. Esther suggests that science may be no more universal than any other form of knowledge. This is a claim that I find myself resisting quite strongly, but unfortunately time didn't allow us to pursue it any further, hopefully another time. I began by asking Esther why she thinks that tools like assessments, indicators, and models are not necessarily as objective as we might think.
Yeah, so you can explain this in different ways, but I usually use the term framing to kind of explain this point, because science or the facts, the results that they produce, does not speak for itself. It's inevitable that you frame scientific findings in a story. And that has nothing to do with manipulation, but it does mean that facts and values become intermingled in a way that is very difficult to disentangle. So that's the first. And particularly when it comes to biodiversity metrics and indicators, there is also the inevitable problem of selection. You cannot measure everything. You inevitably work with proxies or indicators, and these indicators tell you something about the whole, about the thing that they are supposed to represent, but that actually you cannot also do the reality check there, because that would again depend on indicators. So this selectivity is inevitable and it's also useful, but it's also tricky because there's this often repeated saying that we value what we measure. So we should measure what we value. But these two things are very difficult to disentangle because we can only value what we know. So this is the basic point about objectivity. Mm-hmm. Now, when you take a broader perspective about the relation between science and policy, you also have this framing dynamic. So most scientists that I know, and also myself, want to produce knowledge that can make a difference in the world. Particularly in the environmental field and in ecology, that's a key motivation, and it's a really important one. But how do you assess relevance? How do you know that you produce relevant knowledge? And that is if you look at how policymakers or other societal actors frame the problem of biodiversity or the problem of biodiversity loss. If they kind of have a framing that says, where species are becoming extinct, or then scientists will start to produce knowledge about species extinction. If it's ecosystem services, scientists will produce knowledge about ecosystem services. And actually, where do these policy frames of species extinction and ecosystem services come from? They come from science. So also the feedback loop in how dominant frames of what is biodiversity, what is valuable about biodiversity, what should we do with biodiversity and prevent biodiversity loss. These frames are this mixture of policy concerns, societal concerns, and scientific concerns. So these frames determine two things. They determine what is relevant knowledge, and they also determine what is neutral knowledge. Relevant means that there's a connection with the types of decisions that policymakers are considering based on the frames that they use, but neutral knowledge is knowledge that conforms to that frame. Because challenging a dominant frame of biodiversity is very easy to call political. And that's where I see that the feedback loop between policy priorities and research priorities becomes extremely difficult to break out of. Challenging this frame is difficult for scientists because they tend to not want to be political. But this particular focus on neutrality just means that they support dominant interests. Mm. So what it means to be neutral and relevant for scientists is conforming, feeding into, supporting dominant frames. And through that feedback loop between policy priorities and research priorities, these frames become stronger. They become more established. They even become naturalized. And naturalized is a term that I use to kind of show that at a certain moment, a frame stops being seen as a frame. It starts to be seen as reality. Mm. And yeah, reality is, of course, again, another thing that scientists are very committed to for good reasons, right? But this is the problem, in my view.
So if I understand you correctly, it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation almost, because the narrative sort of cycles between, not just between policy and science, I guess sort of, NGOs and other worlds are also involved there, yeah. But it cycles between them and feeds back. You may use the word feedback, I think, yeah. And you don't really know where it comes from originally, right? Or where it's amplified. It could be amplified in one place or another, and then eventually it kind of catches on. I think maybe just a parallel, tell me if you think this is off topic, but something I was thinking about today actually was, again, the way that buzzwords in our field catch on. And I'm not saying that they're good or bad, but things like nature positive, nature-based solutions, ecosystem services, all these things, they kind of take on a life of their own, right? And very often they're replacing something which was almost identical before, but they kind of capture the imagination. It's kind of like a marketing an intentional or unintentional marketing exercise, which then gets latched onto and then, establishes itself. Is that kind of completely off topic, or is that sort of similar to what you're talking about? I know it's not quite the same thing, but is it the same mechanism?
I think, yeah. And I don't know what explains the certain terms from being, taken up. But when I was seeing the term ecosystem services emerging, it just became harder to talk about other values of nature. Mm-hmm. And now it's nature-based solutions and nature positive. So I think in the framing of biodiversity, you also see some climate links. So mm-hmm. Nature positive is linked to net zero, and which was quite prominent in the climate change debates. So you also see that biodiversity wants to mirror climate change. And I don't think that that's necessarily a good idea. Mm-hmm. Because carbon offsetting is one of these tools that has produced very little effects. So why would you try and duplicate this in the biodiversity domain when you know that biodiversity is such a different thing? Mm-hmm. And it will be more complicated and more susceptible to all the problems that are plaguing carbon offsetting. So why would you want to do that? But indeed, if a term becomes dominant, it starts to shape research priorities and policy priorities, and that can really reduce the diversity of biodiversity knowledge that is considered relevant and neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is a problem that directly touches the heart of what I think is scientific integrity.
This kind of problem of, I'm not sure, I was going to call it subjective influence. I'm not sure if that's really quite accurate, but this kind of problem that we're talking about seems especially important in the inter and transdisciplinary collaboration field. And just to clarify for the listeners and for my own understanding is that when I say inter and transdisciplinary, I don't mean between fields, but rather between actors. So the policymaker and the scientist and the local community, for example. That's becoming increasingly highlighted, and I'm going to ask a little bit about that highlight in a moment. But what I wanted to ask now was, what tends to go wrong in those collaborations? Is it mostly sort of a power imbalance issue, or is it also partly a case of what needs to be translated from one knowledge type to another, or is it a combination of these, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so I learned a lot about inter and transdisciplinary types of processes that they aim to integrate different forms of knowledge and that are very often explicitly aimed at making an impact in society and in nature. IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, is actually an example of such a process. Another term that is very often used is science policy interface. Mm-hmm. What happens in these processes of collaboration is a number of things. So first of all, these are led by these norms of neutrality and relevance. So they are geared towards creating knowledge that is seen as neutral because it doesn't challenge dominant frames, and that is relevant because it can influence decision-making by actors that are adopting this dominant frame, that working inside these frames. So they are supposed to bring together diverse forms of knowledge, but this is difficult because knowledge that doesn't adhere to these norms of relevance and neutrality will not be easy to integrate. Mm-hmm. And this gets actively then marginalized. So I think that's a question of power. It's not always overt that people are trying to dominate actively the process, but we are in the biodiversity domain living in a research landscape that is very inequitable, where the large majority of funding goes to natural sciences. And as a result of that, what is taken to be good inter and transdisciplinary collaboration is also dominated by natural sciences. And they believe in the possibility of, they see the world in according to their paradigm in a way that different forms of knowledge can just be added to get the complete picture. So you want to create a complete picture of the problem, the causes, the solutions, so you can add different forms of knowledge. But this integration of knowledge takes place again in such a frame. So forms of knowledge that are not commensurable, that cannot be easily integrated because they question these frames, for example, cannot be tolerated. They are excluded. Mm-hmm. So that is what I see happening in IPBES. It's also what I see happening in other collaborations that have this desire to make an impact.
Right. I think IPBES or IPBES has been, for me, the most clear example of a body trying apparently very hard to integrate these plural values. But sometimes that appears to be, at least in practice, it ends up being a sort of a box-ticking exercise. So in an assessment report, for example, which is the main set of products that IPBES produces, Indigenous and local knowledge will be represented there, but you can see that they're struggling to integrate it. So you mentioned the word add and you mentioned the word integrate, and these are two different things, right? Adding is a lot easier than integrating. And they have added, but I'm not sure if they've managed to integrate it yet. So do you think it's actually possible to integrate, or is it just a box ticking exercise that they're engaging in? Are they going down the wrong path entirely?
Yeah, this to me is really an open question. Yes, IPBES is trying to do this. They're trying to be inclusive of diverse forms of knowledge. This is not symbolic or box ticking. This is a genuine ambition. But the reason why the effects of these intentions and ambitions is leaves things to be desired is because of other dynamics in IPBES that govern how these assessments are framed and produced. So there's a lot of things going on here. First of all, other forms of knowledge are always underrepresented in the author teams because of this inequitable research landscape. There's just fewer of us. There are paradigms of knowledge that do not fit with the dominant paradigm that governs these assessments. And these can come from different places. Indigenous and local forms of knowledge systems, but also some forms of social science and humanities come from paradigms that sit in tension with these dominant paradigms.
Mm-hmm.
So the ambition to be inclusive is genuine, but integration is not possible from a place of incommensurability, because integration then simply means co-option. It means that everything that is distinctive, unique, and important about these forms of knowledge, not everything, but some things, they are translated away. So translation is in a sense an activity that produces epistemic violence in some sense. Translation means that things get lost. And because you have these power imbalances, other paradigms are underrepresented. There has to be a consensus view in the assessment. That's why these efforts are unlikely to fully succeed. And it's also unclear what success looks like, actually.
IPBES, was it IPBES or was it the CBD? It was the CBD. Not so long ago produced, I think it was actually the second volume of a biodiversity outlook from the point of view of Indigenous peoples and local communities. I guess that was an attempt to express those alternative points of view or pluralistic points of view. Do you think that's the right way to go? If it's not possible to integrate, should it just be presented separately?
Yeah, for me, these assessments don't have to be so coherent. If you look at the chapters, you will also find that they're not always so coherent. But to me, this plurality of frames of biodiversity, concepts of biodiversity, types of knowledge, could also be more openly and transparently expressed.
Mm-hmm.
And that means indeed that you would have these knowledge systems stand more next to each other instead of integrated into a consensus narrative. I do see that as a possible way forward. I also understand why people would object against it.
Right. Although I'd be interested to know your thoughts on why they might object to it, because for me, it seems like almost like a win-win situation because it makes things easier. Number one, it enables each group, the science group and the rest to express things the way that they would like to express them. And it means that they don't need to worry about, all the complicated and potentially impossible ways that they might have to integrate each other. So what is the drawback of something like that?
I think the main drawback comes back again to these really important norms of neutrality and relevance. So if the assessment cannot speak with one voice, some people fear that the authority of the assessments will fall. I think if you look at the state of biodiversity and how assessments have actually contributed to more effective forms of biodiversity conservation, I think that's questionable. But I understand, because you also sometimes see that there's a real power from this consensus view. And the other thing is that if science cannot speak with one voice, that there's a risk of politicization. Because if the differences are not resolvable through science, apparently something else is going on here as well. So the neutrality of the assessments is then also at stake. But these are, so perceived neutrality, right? Because I don't think that there's such a thing as neutrality.
I'm reminded also that, as far as I know, or as far as I remember, the second global assessment, which is currently underway, they decided to have a separate chapter on Indigenous peoples and local communities, right? Specifically. So that seems to be perhaps a nice middle path that might serve.
I'm very curious. Yeah. I thought that this was that was a very interesting step that is really worth trying. And I'm very curious.
Certainly worth trying, right? Because they haven't tried it before. So
they've tried other things, and this is definitely worth a try.
Yeah, because if, whether it's in the same volume or if it's two assessments under the same IPBES banner, in both cases, you could have the endorsement of IPBES, for that knowledge. I guess maybe the drawback would be if knowledge ends up being contradictory. I mean, that's perhaps my greatest interest is when pieces of knowledge can actually give entirely opposite points of view. But that should also be okay, right? I mean, that's how science works as well. People are allowed to.
I think that's okay, but other people get very nervous.
Esther, I wanted to take sort of a slightly different tack, and this is maybe less within your area of interest, so we can see how much time we want to spend on it. But the kind of initially I was thinking about it as being the opposite side of the coin, but not so much. It's just maybe a different point of view, which is held by some, is that increasingly, and I'm thinking about the IPBES world specifically because that's what I'm most familiar with, but I think it applies to IPCC and other similar processes and tools and things. The trend seems to be toward almost over-inclusion of these diverse, pluralistic points of view, to the extent that it's kind of confusing a lot of people. I remember sitting at an IPBES meeting where one of the delegates was every time another sentence of a SPM of a IPBES assessment was presented, he would try to get alternative wording into that sentence. So maybe this is another argument against trying to integrate, these other points of view. But this is a different point. The point here is is that possibly actually giving too much weight to something as a compensation for the fact that no acknowledgement was given in the past?
Well, there's a limit to inclusion, right? Also theoretically, because you cannot know what you have not included, right? So theoretically, it's the total inclusion is impossible. The argument for pluralism that I find important is that that inclusion requires equity. You cannot actually, if you have inclusion in a situation of inequity, you get the troubles that we're seeing. So this equity component of pluralism is really important. And what that actually means is that what I see as a risk is that you become inclusive of intolerant voices. So if you allow in voices that are themselves intolerant of plurality, that is a direct threat to plurality. So that's where we need to draw the line. And I'm not saying that this is easy, but that's where we need to draw the line. And if we have equity, within these plural perspectives, we have the checks and balances that you need to prevent the dominant voices. And I think this is a key insight from democratic theory. I think it's useful to apply this to science and to processes of inter and transdisciplinary collaboration, particularly those that aim to make an impact in society and policy. It's not completely transferable from democracies to scientific processes, but still I think it's worth also applying that type of thinking to these scientific processes. Not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's certainly partly. But just at the risk of asking a stupid question, what do you mean by equity in this case? In this sort of framing, like what would equity look like?
Yeah, voice and vote potentially. Mm-hmm. So if you have 9 natural scientists and 1 social scientist, you might have inclusion but not equity. Mm-hmm. So it's again about these power dynamics that if we really want to open up towards multiple frames and understandings of biodiversity and what we should be doing, you need to have equity, because otherwise you'll have 9 people that can claim neutrality, relevance, science, truth, objectivity, and you'll have 1 person, who will be considered to be the opposite of all these things. Mm-hmm. So that is why simply inclusion or simply diversity will not be sufficient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is again making me think and curious about how it could work if an organization like IPBES were to just create parallel streams. I think you still, because I was going to say earlier on, you still need some kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, gatekeeper or something like that. Someone who sort of, maybe gatekeeper is the wrong word, but I think you know what I mean, right? Someone who sort of coordinates the process without influencing it, which is tricky in itself. But that is exactly what intergovernmental organizations like IPBES are supposed to do, right? At least in theory. They're not supposed to influence the content of their products at all. So if they, or if the countries that they convene agreed on something like that, on parallel streams, then it would be up to them simply to make sure those processes run smoothly.
Yeah, this is true. But there's actually many ways in which the process gets influenced. Mm-hmm. Also the content, it's not necessarily IPBES, but governments. Mm-hmm. And in the government negotiations of, for example, the scope, so governments dominate that process. So here we also have a lack of pluralism, because societal organizations have a much less strong vote. So indigenous people and local communities themselves, IPBES values their knowledge, but they don't have the same rights to negotiate the scope of the assessment and the summary for policymakers. So here also we see that there's influence from specific governments, much larger than other governments, and definitely larger than societal organizations and indigenous peoples and local communities. I also think that is a challenge to the scientific integrity of the assessment. I do think that.
Mm-hmm. I'm also just wondering, though, this parallel streams idea, I won't keep on going on about it, but it's something that really intrigues me. The way I set it up was, you have this scientific assessment and then you have the other assessment. But my question to myself and maybe to you now is like, there's not just one other stream, is there? There could be any number of other streams. So maybe that's a bit of a problem. But at the same time, nobody is being prevented from producing an assessment.
No.
The only thing that's not happening is that organizations like IPBES actually have a track for such assessments.
No, this is true. I'm intrigued by that idea as well. And you have other assessments. I mean, or maybe they're not called assessments, but there are other global reports, sometimes funded by philanthropies, sometimes just scientific initiatives, I don't know, that try to do these things for specific topics, or the Environmental Justice Atlas. There has been a global assessment of social progress. There's the Earth Commission. So indeed, there are different reports, but the big difference is that these are also Eat Lancet. In the UN system, there's also other organizations that produce reports, like in FAO. These global environmental assessments have this process of government approval and government negotiations. That's a big difference.
That also maybe brings me to another question, but sort of from a slightly different angle. And that is kind of, again, the sort of gatekeeping idea. If an organization, I keep going back to IPBES, but I'm talking about more generally than that. If IPBES, which means all the governments that constitute IPBES, were to support something like, these additional assessments, for example, as one way of getting that knowledge across in a more influential way, those governments would also, they would still have to agree that that knowledge was valuable, right? And some governments certainly do, others don't.
Yeah.
But what about, just to play a devil's advocate, for the governments that might not support something like that, they might be saying, well, we trust in Western science, this concept called Western science, and we know that Indigenous knowledge has a lot to offer, but, we wouldn't trust it with our lives. We'd be more inclined to trust science, well, not with our lives, but with these major decisions. So, is that a stumbling block? I mean, is that an overcomable obstacle?
Well, if governments want to block something, they can, because the process operates through consensus. So any country can veto something, and then it doesn't happen. And we saw that recently with the Global Environmental Outlook, that did not lead to an approved summary for policymakers.
Right.
So these negotiations are, because of other geopolitical developments, these negotiations are becoming more difficult. And I think we'll see more of that in the future. And perhaps biodiversity has been a bit different. I'm trying to figure out why. It's still not so political as, for example, plastics or climate. I think there's reasons, but it's a bit speculative. But they are also within IPBES. We see that they're becoming more difficult, and that means that the approach of negotiating through consensus is reaching its limits. So if governments want to block something, they will.
Right.
At the same time, IPBES is not the CBD. So if a certain text is presented as representative of state-of-the-art knowledge, and the country is a member of IPBES, so they have already accepted that in addition to science, other forms of knowledge are equally relevant and credible.
Which they have done, right?
Yeah, which they have done. So this text is presented as representing the state-of-the-art knowledge. It is not easy for a government to say that they disagree with that, because they don't want to be seen as anti-science. It would almost be, and maybe countries are caring much less about that these days than in other time periods. But it's still a difficult thing, because the entire circus depends on governments asking for the state-of-the-art knowledge and relying on experts to deliver them the state-of-the-art knowledge. They can't be seen to have their own opinion about what the state-of-the-art knowledge is without actually undermining the very foundation of that institutional arrangements. So despite my sort of concerns with what these notions are doing to scientific integrity, in the political process of IPBES, the function of that contract is clear. It does some work there. I think it's not helping biodiversity as much as it should, but in terms of creating a culture among these negotiators that, you can't really do that. You can't really challenge these experts on their expertise that you have asked for. That is sort of a civilizing process that has its merits.
Countries are very often driven by very specific concerns. So there's many countries in the hall together, and then suddenly one of them who has been quiet for 3 days, pipes up to say something very specific. And I think most countries are there mostly for that reason, to protect national interests, essentially. That's what it boils down to. And that can mean not committing to something that they don't want to commit to. And it can also mean maybe the most sort of serious of all in their eyes would be anything that paints their country in a bad light, in particular. Not necessarily mentioning their country, but sort of alluding to something that they've perhaps done wrong. So the whole process is not entirely guided. And when I say the process, I'm talking about the process of approving summaries for policymakers. So this is quite specific, although it applies to some other environmental governance procedures. But very often that's what it's about. It's not so much about making the SPM the best product possible, but in making sure that our interests are protected as number one priority, right? The rest comes after that. So I guess that's also a big part of it. And it's, again, very much something that rests on national governments themselves.
Yeah, all global politics is national politics,
right?
In a way. And for me, who is not an expert on these, I also very often don't know what is behind a certain statement or a certain projection, or you that to me makes it unpredictable. I don't know these things. Countries know this about each other better, I think. But for me, as like a academic, it's sometimes very surprising. And then I hear somebody explaining it to me. I think, oh, of course. But it has to be translated for IPBES through this lens of evidence and science. But yeah, there's very specific things behind it. Indeed, this is true.
You might find situations where there'll be a government delegate arguing with an expert who's sitting on the stage, and they're arguing about the same line of text, but the one is arguing from a scientific point of view and the other one's arguing from a political point of view, right? And until they reach a compromise, or until the one realizes well, I think the political point of view always knows what the other point of view is, but that might not be the most important thing to them. But then you often find the scientist or the expert is simply trying to defend what they see as the facts, and that's not necessarily what the discussion's about from the other side.
Yeah, for example, and this is why, I mean, they also have very different interpretations of concepts, and they draw these interpretations also from literature, which also uses a wide variety of interpretations of concepts. People are never talking about the same biodiversity, I would venture.
Right.
Because definitions of biodiversity in each research paper is kind of different. And there's attempts to harmonize this with standardized indicators, etc. But also notions of rights, definition of indigenous peoples and local communities. Yeah, it's very hard to figure that out.
Right. Esther, I had one more question, but I think we might have covered it all. When does epistemic pluralism, which is what we've been talking about most of the time, when does it work well and when does it start to go wrong? But I think you've pretty much answered this already. You know, the four areas that I had in mind before we spoke, and maybe you've added to them now, but let me just name them quickly. So the one I would say is where marginalized perspectives are included symbolically. So this is the sort of box ticking exercise. So that's one thing we've discussed already. Another one is kind of, you could say, paralysis, where too many forms of knowledge and value make it hard to say anything clear. And I think that in my view, I think that is a problem, maybe not the main problem. But
for me, it's not the main problem.
Do you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a problem I would like to have. right? So some problems are I think the problem that we have now of suppression and exclusion and marginalization is a so it's kind of I would like to be in the situation where that's our problem.
Right. Well, actually, those were exactly the other two.
Really, so for me, this matters not just because I want to not just because we want to be taken seriously with our expertise, and this is not always happening in IPBES or in other kind of collaborations, but also because it really matters. I mean, if we see the track record of conventional conservation informed by conventional conservation science, it's not in all cases a pretty track record. So it has led to all kinds of injustices with often bad outcomes, not just for people, but also for biodiversity. So where we see areas that are doing better in terms of standard biodiversity metrics, you also see very often an engagement of communities with different knowledge systems that are not focusing on maximizing numbers of species according to traditional metrics. No, they're working in these areas. They're taking care of these areas through their much more intimate perhaps connections with nature, the forms of knowledge that they get from these practical engagements. And this is not just about indigenous people and local communities, but also, of course, about that. But also in a country like the Netherlands, where people care for their areas, they are not counting species necessarily. They're just doing agroecological forms of food production that work with the seasons, with the rhythms of nature. So this really matters if we are going to ever achieve effective biodiversity conservation. We have to work with the types of knowledges that actually make a difference on the ground. So it's not just about epistemic justice. This is about effectiveness ultimately.
But I mean, this is a common critique of that form of knowledge, is that it is very often localized and context specific. So that just makes me wonder, I mean, maybe double question. That's the one thing. The other thing is that, I mean, would you say that science has been on the whole a good thing or a bad thing? Because to say it's a bad thing is quite a big statement to make, right?
Yeah. And I don't want to, I mean, universities are important and science is important, but I think that if we don't get this plurality in our academic institutions, yeah, there's major parts of science that serve vested interests, that actively serve the vested interests that are destroying the planet. And this is, conservation science that is more focused on protected areas than on addressing the drivers of loss. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's doing good. I'm honestly not sure. And ultimately, all knowledge is local. All knowledge is specific. All knowledge is value driven. All knowledge is local. And all knowledge is partial and selective. So I don't also want to accept that distinction. Science is differently local, but not universal at all. If it's universal, it's because it's good at universalizing